Welcome to A Therapist, Buddhist, and You. My name is Luke DuBois, and I'm here with co-host Zalmal.
Hello, Luke. How are you?
Glad for another rendition, an episode of our podcast. We're a couple episodes in, and we're really enjoying it and beginning to get in our groove. So we're excited to continue this and offer more and more of this.
It's been fun.
Good. So we're in our part 2, our section of definition of addiction. We did our first breakdown of the short version, the short definition of addiction. And we had so much in our first episode. We want to do a second piece with the second portion of this definition. And I wanted to bring this to the podcast for a few reasons. We often hear people in recovery or addicts that say, gosh, my loved ones just don't understand what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. They don't know what it's like to be an addict, how I think. And there is often a butting heads or schism between, quote unquote, substance abuser, addict, and then the family member. So offering this and breaking it down and giving different perspectives, it often allows both sides, both family members, loved ones, to really have a grasp and understanding and empathize and understand, oh, this is what's going on. This is why my loved one's doing that. And for the substance user or the person in recovery, yes, that's why I do that.
Yeah. I think there is something to be said about the understanding, understanding and feeling understood, that can put people at ease, even if they are problems. But if I have a good understanding of the problem, it's better than being in the unknown. So this can be very useful. And I asked you the same question in the part 1 of let me just pretend that I am my parents and asking you this question, because it would have been very helpful for them to have this information when they saw their son struggling. So I know this is going on at this moment as we are talking out in the society of addiction, and also parents, loved ones, confused, so I'm really happy that we're doing this, and I guess I'll also keep acting as an interviewer to you. Mm-hmm. And I want to hear your expertise on this. So why don't we get started? Do you want to read that second paragraph? I think it took us at least 30 minutes for the first paragraph. So this one might take equally the same amount. Not sure, but go ahead and read it then. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, and we'll see where how long it goes. But before we jump in, like I mentioned previous episode, this is put together, and I think I previously said by a bunch of doctors and physicians with a whole lot more letters behind their name than I, and just a little brief history about the American Society of Addiction Medicine that I believe is actually in Maryland, maybe Bethesda or Chevy Chase, if I'm not mistaken, formed in 1954. And they realized that there was such a lack of education and training for physicians on the topic of addiction. And they realized, we need to do something. So it was first the American Society of Alcoholism. And, there's a problem with alcoholism in the 50s, but guess what? In the 70s, they changed it to the American Society of Addiction Medicine to cover all forms of substance use and abuse. The American Medical Association, the average medical school curriculum dedicates only 19 hours to the topic of substance use disorder. 19 hours. So we have these physicians that have a whole lot of training and only kind of get just a little piece of education and information on understanding what substance use is, and reason for the formation of the American Society of Addiction Medicine. So hopefully we can help not just family members, but some physicians out there as well. All right. You ready?
Yes, I am ready.
Addiction is characterized by inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and a dysfunctional emotional response. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. Without treatment or engagement in recovery activities, addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. once again, there's a whole lot of words and psychobabble in there, if you ask me.
Mm.
So let's look at it. Let's break it down a little bit, so that way it's not just a bunch of physicians compacting all these words together to make sense for you and I and our listeners.
Mm.
Addiction is characterized by the inability to consistently abstain. Well, that can look like a couple different things. Hey, I'll stop drinking. I won't drink before 5 p.m. Or I'll only drink Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And what happens? They don't do that. What could be another way that you've seen in life, whether it's your personal experiences or you've seen other people in this journey have an inability to consistently abstain?
Yeah, the word consistently
Mm-hmm.
jumped at me. But as you were talking, as you're reading, what made me think of is, this is not original. I've heard it from other experienced people, is that regular people, when they have a goal, they change their behavior to meet their goals. But for addicts and alcoholics, people who are suffering from addiction, they don't change their behaviors to meet the goals, but they change their goals to meet their behavior. So when I see the word consistency, that's what it makes me think of, that there is something inconsistent, because I set something for myself, or an addict, objectively set something for themselves, and they don't meet it. And then it's not their fault at the same time, because there is the word inability, which is in the 12 steps that is described as the powerlessness, which I translate as inability to, that they have no power of choice for this.
Isn't it interesting that the inability to abstain consistently can change into, I chose not to be consistent this time. It turns into, I changed my mind. And I often get people in private practice that don't want to teetotal or go completely abstinence, and that's fine, right? But they want to reduce or minimize their substance use, often alcohol. So this is a great parameter. Great. How much do you want to reduce? And then we make it very specific and measurable. Oh, I only want to drink on Fridays. I don't want to have any more than 4 drinks, 3 glasses of wine, whatever it may be. And I said, that's great. So you've got a very specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic and timely, a SMART goal, if you will. And then we find out relatively quickly if they can consistently abstain or minimize their drinking. And this is a good parameter of, okay, whether it's addiction or substance use issue, right? So, yeah, that inability to consistently abstain. Now, it doesn't say in this definition how consistent, right? So that can be in interpretation. Mm-hmm. Well, does it mean I don't drink for a week, a month, 6 months, a year? It just says consistently. The brain, the rational, logical part that we talked about in the previous episode, can go logically, I can consistently abstain when I choose to, as opposed to what other people may see in their life, their family members, their loved ones, their coworkers and things like that. So Interesting example there, right?
Yeah. And since from the beginning, it has drawn a line between addicts and non-addicts, because a person who is not suffering from addiction will see this and, yes, I do have the ability to consistently abstain.
I don't drink every day. I don't smoke pot every day.
Yeah. And I don't think about it, when I'm not doing it.
Yeah. I'm not obsessing about it 24/7. I can abstain from that. Yeah. Hey, listeners. We've got something extraordinary to share, a chance to reshape your journey no matter where you are. You're familiar with Zalmal's insights on our podcast, but there's more. Through the Recovery Collective, he offers life, mindfulness, recovery coaching, and meditation groups guiding you toward a fulfilled and mindful existence, no matter your location. Zal's journey from a Burmese Buddhist novice to a skilled practitioner equips him with timeless wisdom and contemporary strategies. Whether you're navigating life's shifts, seeking clarity, or pursuing self-awareness, Zal's coaching serves as a compass guiding you toward success. The best part? Zal's approach centers on your growth and empowerment. He equips you with tools to tap into your inner strengths for continuous evolution no matter where you are. Ready to take that next step in your personal growth journey? Connect with Zal Mall and the Recovery Collective at 240-813-8135 from anywhere in the world. Investigating in your journey reaps immeasurable rewards. Let Zal Mall guide you toward resilience, clarity, and empowerment no matter where life finds you. Now, let's transition back into our conversation. Stay tuned, stay curious, and keep your journey growing.
Yeah. And then before moving on to the second part, I also wanted to point out or ask you a question about the consistently abstain also implies that they can abstain, except that they cannot stay abstain. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So abstain in the literal term is not using, right? Not imbibe in the substance use. So I abstain from that. I'm not using. Yeah. Consistently, where they might interpret in their own version.
Mm.
Impairment and behavioral control. I want to stop right there. Impairment and behavioral control. So that could be the behavior to engage in substance use or to continue to use it, or negative consequences that come with that behavior. Right? Impairment and behavioral control. So you might not be using, but do you have behavioral control issues when you're not using? So for some people, if they have a potential use disorder or a daily use disorder, when they stop using, there could be irritability, frustration, projection, anger, blaming, right? So there's impairment in those type of behaviors. How do you cope when you're not coping with a substance? I always tell people that the way you think, feel, and act gets you closer to a drink or drug or farther away. So if you're not imbibing in the substances, then your behaviors of coping, how you think, feel, and act could be in a dysfunctional way, right? The way it's said in the first paragraph is dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biopsychosocial spiritual manifestations in a dysfunctional way. So it's highlighting that again when it comes to behavioral control. So we can see that literally in forms of, okay, like we said earlier, you can't not just drink every Friday and only have 3 glasses of wine or 2 glasses of wine, that you wind up drinking a whole bottle. Or, okay, I won't smoke pot more than, right before a test, but there I go again. I used, even though my specific measurable goal was to not use, and you wind up using, right? The goal that you set. Impairment and behavioral control, craving. So what does craving mean to you when we think of cravings?
Yeah, that to me actually interestingly is a very Buddhist term. In Buddhism, the word is tanha, which translates as the clinging, that there is this uncontrollable clinging onto a sensual desire. So craving is an unsatisfied thirst that can never be quenched in a way. So that's what me thinks of. The craving is that I really want it. I want it. And when I have it, it's not satisfied. And I want more. So craving is a very, very powerful word.
Very. Because we can crave substance. We can crave lust. We can crave food. We can crave things obsessively, which can become habit forming, which could become addictive forming. Can you expand more on the craving part? Because I think that's so Buddhism, that's a huge piece when it comes to noticing or acknowledging those cravings.
Yeah. So as I mentioned in the previous episode too, and people who have studied, even if it's a little bit of Buddhism, know about this, the 4 Noble Truths. And the first Noble Truth is life is full of suffering, which is a translation, but I think the more precise translation is, instead of life is full of suffering or I am suffering, the right translation is there is suffering in life, or there is suffering. That's it. That's the first Noble Truth. And then the second Noble Truth is the cause of the why there's suffering, and the cause is craving, clinging, attaching.
So a desire to the level of craving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And specifically in the second noble truth, there are 3 categories, which is birth, clinging to birth without our control. I have already been attached to birth. That's why we were born.
Yeah.
And then there is also, there are 2 other categories, but one of them is there's a desire for becoming, like we want to keep existing, but there is also a desire or clinging for non-becoming, which is like annihilation. When life is like too depressing, too bad, we have a strong craving for the extermination of life, which is also another form of suffering. So clinging, I don't know. For me as a Buddhist, that explains about the nature of things so well, that with or without my permission, there is attachment. I'm going to keep clinging, you know.
And that form of attachment, clinging, and craving can lead to impairment in behavioral control. How we act or react or cope to desire or reach that craving that we desire can be done often in a toxic or a dysfunctional way. Right? And that's when it becomes, in this definition, an addiction. These couple words are my favorite. After it says, addiction is characterized by the inability to consistently abstain, impairment, behavioral control, craving, and here's the piece, diminished recognition of significant problems. I'll boil that down into one word. That one word of diminished recognition of significant problems is denial. Denial, right? If we have a lesser realization of these significant problems in our life, then that could be a form of denial. The way I explain it to clients or loved ones of people in early recovery or trying to define recovery is that they have an addiction that tells them that they don't have an addiction. They have a substance use disorder that's telling them, you're okay. You're all right. It's not that bad. They have a substance, a liquid, a powder, a smoke that's trying to kill them. And they're telling themselves, no, I'm nowhere near close to dying. No wonder this thing's an epidemic and a pandemic. That they've got a disease of addiction that tells them that they don't have a disease. Wow. Well, why is that? We know in the first episode of how it damages the brain. First thing it damages is the cerebral cortex. This is important to highlight. The cerebral cortex is responsible for ration, logic, and reason. That part of the brain is damaged first, meaning, hey, you say I've got a problem and all these negative consequences are happening in my life, and I'm telling you as an addict, but I'll be okay. Hey, you got your 3rd DUI. Hey, you almost hurt your children, or you did hurt your children in an altered state. But I'm not that bad. So there's this cycle of this substance is trying to convince us 12 steps parallel with a medical model and say, we admitted we're powerless over drugs and alcohol and that our lives have become unmanageable. Why? Because they have diminished recognition of significant problems, that they have a dysfunctional, emotional, physical response. So they go hand in hand again.
Yeah. So that raises the question, if I still put myself into my parents' shoes. So I'll ask that question to you.
Good.
No matter how much I love somebody, no matter how much my parents love me, there is also a layer of personality. I'm a parent now and, my kids are very young, but when they misbehave, there's this tendency for me to, what's going on with you? There's like a repulsion or some kind of judgment. So like, although we might or might not have this information, but if somebody like myself who was in denial with my problem and my parents are seeing it, and there can be that immediate repulsion, like, why doesn't he get it? Because there's an exhibition of denial. So how do you help them to overcome that,
Because I look at the loved one and I look them straight in the eyes and I say, because he is sick, because he has a brain disease, and you were talking to the substance, the addiction, the alcohol, and you're not talking to your son, your daughter, your loved one, your husband, your wife. He is sick. He doesn't know how to determine the difference between right and wrong, what's healthy and what's not healthy. This thing is trying to kill him, depending on where he's at in the progression of the substance use and how much damage it's done to the brain and body and how much detox and things like that. And it's convincing him that he's okay. So a lot of times I help loved ones or spouses or even the children of their parents that you will support their recovery, but not their addiction. So we talk about that manifestation that's so obvious, evident, and apparent to the loved ones and the spouses, and they go, why do they not see it? Because they're sick. And their brain has been dysfunctionally altered to keep them in this cycle, which is why it's an epidemic. So when people go, hey, let me do 2 to 4 to 8 to 14 days of quote unquote detox, whether it's at a hospital or a detox facility, and you send them right back in the workplace or right back into their daily life, and they don't treat this thing like a chronic disease, we are setting them up for failure. Any other organ or part of the body that is damaged and needs to rehab, we allow that action to take place and treat it like so. If you get an ACL injury, the physician will do a graft or use part of your other ligaments and connect it and go, all right, you got an ACL. But if you don't do the physical therapy afterwards, what good is it? You have to do the action and set up the conditions, continue, and then you guess what? A couple weeks, couple months, you check back to make sure it's healing right. You continue to do the physical therapy. Now we're talking about a brain that's ever evolving and changing, and the significant damage we do to that by smothering and poisoning the brain. I call it the detox. D-E means remove, tox, poison. We're removing the poison, and now we need to let that brain to heal, which can take up to 6 to 24 months for that brain to really begin to heal itself with the central nervous system. And we might talk about post-acute withdrawal in a future episode, and that could be a whole episode, but there's symptoms and a syndrome is a group of symptoms that happen after the acute withdrawal, the detox phase, because the brain needs to heal. The cerebral cortex gets injured, the logic, the reason, and then it moves down, and then it's the midbrain, the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory and emotions. So it says diminished recognition of significant problems, denial with one's behaviors, and interpersonal relationships. I say this is a disease of interpersonal relationships, meaning there's nothing more that the addiction, the substance use that likes to work on than my relationship with you. That, hey, the loved ones are like, why do they not see it? Why do they not see that all these negative things are happening and this liquid, this powder, this substance is destroying their life? And then the addict gets triggered emotionally by what? These relationships, loved ones, work. And then the emotional response becomes, oh, I don't like feeling this way. Why are my loved ones, family members frustrated at me? I know how to feel different. I know how to emotionally alter myself where I feel better. And then that becomes the number one coping mechanism eventually for that emotional reaction, that emotional response. And it becomes more and more dysfunctional. So then it becomes use more. And how else do I emotionally respond? Defensively, reactionary, arguments, justification, manipulation. And all of a sudden, their addiction begins to train their loved ones. That their manipulation of the disease begins to change the whole dynamic in the family because I want to keep using, my disease does, and I'm going to emotionally affect you so that way I can keep using. Powerful stuff.
Yeah, that is powerful. It's an animal of his own, like a creature, powerful creature of his own, a monster.
Doubles down.
Yeah. But as you were talking, I can help, because I'm a Buddhist, and also what I do at Recovery Collective is mindfulness. So I am looking at everything that you were saying from those two aspects, and two things jump out to me. One of them is craving, which we've already talked about. But there's also an aspect in craving which has a lot to do with selfishness. That when I'm craving for something, it's not about anybody else. It's about me. For me, I need to feel better. I want this. Only when I have it, everything will be fine, you know? So like when that craving becomes the center of my attention, everything is out of proportion. That relationships, no, don't really matter. Job, no, don't really matter. This is the most important thing. And that feeds with the impairment, you know, when I'm channel vision onto something with fixed view of strong desires, then everything is blurry compared to that.
I think every loved one and family member says, yes, they are selfish to the core, that they are craving so much that they do selfishly. Now, one thing I want the audience to look at is, wait a minute, as a human being, to your point, Zal, we have natural craving tendencies. We have that ability to crave, and it might not be to the level of an addict's addiction, but boy, do all human beings have this ability to crave and desire and cling in an unhealthy way.
Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect. The other aspect that I was thinking of is from the idea of the mind. So the diseases in the mind, that's what they say in the 12-step fellowship, which to your point earlier about if I have a physical condition and if it's just the physical body, I accept it, I see it. But if the problem is both in the body and the mind, the disease is also in the mind, which tricks you that you don't have it. So like it explains about the disease inhabiting in the mind as well. But for me as a Buddhist, I would even take it further even to say that, they are dependent on each other in a way. So I guess in 12-step terms, people talk about when you have a problem, you try to solve the material problem with a material solution. And it is cyclical. The problem never goes away because you're just scratching the surface. But this is more of a medical thing that we're reading, but in the recovery community,
it's parallel.
It's all about spiritual. So when you have a material problem, the tendency is to solve it with a material solution, but the spiritual solution is the key. And I think that's also why the 12-step and other spiritual tools work for this, because the way you have described this disease, it is beyond human power in a way, it is very scary, and it really sounded like a tornado in a way when you're describing about this person who is like a cancer, like affecting everybody around you,
And medical advancements are wonderful. We now have multiple forms of craving reducers for a good amount of substance and chemicals. But that is treating one piece of this addiction. You can minimize a craving, but with this definition, it doesn't mean that you're dealing with the dysfunctional emotional responses with their interpersonal relationships. It doesn't mean that this anti-craving medication for opiates or alcohol or benzos can help you with the manifestations that are obvious, evident, apparent, and the logical ration and reasoning is off. That's only one piece to this whole thing. So I'm glad that they call it medical assisted treatment. A lot of these anti-craving medications, because it's designed to do just that. Assist the treatment so that way you're not obsessing about a craving so much, so that way you can deal with these other pieces of the addiction. Mm-hmm. It's fitting, right? Mm-hmm. But what do people often do? Quick fix society. If I just wasn't having this craving and I wasn't obsessing, I'm fine. That's the logic. That's the reasoning. And then often relapse happens quicker than later a lot of times. So far, so good, huh?
Yeah, it's pretty dense, pretty packed.
Second half of this. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. So other chronic diseases, we talked about COPD in the previous episode, diabetes, HIV, right? Alzheimer's. These are all chronic diseases. These are forever diseases. We're very fortunate with this one. There's not a lot of, and people can comment and help me with this one. I don't know if there's any other chronic disease, if you treat every aspect of this addiction, this disease, that not only will you no longer use the substance that you're addicted to, that you're craving, but your life will get better in every aspect if you treat this thing physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. I mean, that's just my perspective. That is why I think people say they're fortunate and grateful addicts and alcoholics, because if they don't just treat the craving, but if they treat the dysfunctional emotional responses, if they treat how they cope, if they treat rational logic and reason, if they treat their inner source, their spiritual self, that man, not only are they grateful, they become a person that they're very happy to be.
Yeah, I think we touched on that a little bit too last time, which got me a little fired up, which is that it talks about recovery, but it's not a factory reset. It's an upgraded, top-notch car, because it's beyond, what was possible. So yeah, it's not written in here, but I'm glad that we're extracting that good news out of this very factual writing.
Yeah, it can seem gloom, right? Like, oh my gosh, this is a forever thing. Yeah, but your life will get better if you treat this thing. Not only will you not be doing the behavior, your life gets better. Good. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. So relapse, when you think of relapse with substance use, what do you think of?
The part we haven't read is also the nature of the progression. So it's going back to the old habits without not drinking for 6 months and then picking up again, thinking that this time is different. That is a relapse. And also, there's another fancy term, which is probably made up, a prelapse, Okay. Again, the mind and the body, the disease is in the mind. So before the relapse, there is something prelapse already within the mind,
And we often hear it say another way, and we talk about this in my relapse prevention group, that you relapse before you ever pick up. Meaning what? There are signs and symptoms. The way you think, the way you feel, the way you act and react can get you closer to a drink or drug or farther away. So yes, that relapse can look by, I didn't use a substance for 3 months, 6 months, and then you use. But couldn't a form of, according to this definition, relapse be a dysfunction emotional response that is so connected with your substance use? Lying, or coping with an emotion in an unhealthy way? That could be a relapse. In Al-Anon, right, they work a 12-step program in Al-Anon. Al-Anon is a 12-step program for loved ones and family members and friends of the addict and alcoholic, that they work a 12-step program. And they're obviously not using substances, but a relapse to them might be, gosh, I bought my loved one, I gave my loved one money again, or my friend money again, and I was just hopeful that he wouldn't use it and he'd buy gas with it or groceries, and he used drugs again, and I felt like I relapsed. But it can look differently. We often think about it just as the substance use. But I think the powerful thing in support groups and relapse prevention groups and 12-step groups is you get to see how you think, feel, and act. Powerful.
Yeah. Before moving on to the next sentence, I have another question. In addition to Buddhism and mindfulness, I also have philosophy background. That's what I studied in college. So
that's why you're here. It's all multifaceted.
So I do have a question about the word cycle. So that to me means predictable, cyclical. Cycles mean it is repeated.
Patterns.
So like from your point of view and your expertise, like for recovery, does recovery take you out of the cycle, or does it defeat the nature cycle, since we're talking about the upgraded car?
I have never met a person in well over a decade of working with in the world of substance use and recovery that I've never met one person that relapsed for just one reason, meaning there was a cycle, that there were a pattern, that there were cyclical thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that they did not see. But when I helped them look at it and break it down, how they think, feel, act, and react, I guess I didn't just act on impulse like I thought, that there were a bunch of signs and symptoms and behaviors and reactions that I didn't connect to my quote-unquote addictive thinking or my disease or my addiction. So yeah, it is cyclical. And I love doing the relapse prevention group because I got a group of people that help each other directly or indirectly look at those things, so that way they stay way far away from it and don't get so close. and acknowledge some of these cycles before it gets there.
Yeah. Clarity is the key word, right? Or thorough understanding. That's also my understanding. There's this concept, which is the opposite of, the ultimate goal in Buddhism is that well-known term nirvana, or nibbana in Pali, which is the cessation of everything. I think it's actually a cooking term where you put out the fire, nibbana. So, which the opposite is samsara, which translates as cycle of suffering, a chain of cause and effect. But then the way you're explaining about these cycles is that when you are in this relapse prevention group or when people are in the recovery community, there is something very clear about the cycle. And when you see it, you have, I don't know if power is the right word, but you have advantage point over that, oh, this is my cycle, and I don't like it. And then you can break it down.
Time for a personal, vulnerable story, Zal.
I'm ready.
So just last year, and I'm fortunate enough that I get to do my relapse prevention group, and it gives me a consciousness of this distorted thinking and potential unmanageability. And even though I've got people with 3 years, 2 years, and a year sobriety in this group, that sometimes this thinking is a chronic disease, right? This is a forever addiction. And I've got 2 little ones, and my wife and I were butting heads over something. I don't remember it, so I know it was unbelievably stupid and selfish on my part and craving something that I wanted. And I previously worked with a man in his 60s, and every time he relapsed, he would relapse on like an energy drink, right? And it was Monster, Red Bull, whatever it was. And I just got in a frustrating argument with my wife, and I'm going down to the local tool shop or whatever, and I saw, I was just revved up, angry, stupid angry. And I saw this refrigerator of energy drinks. And my first thought was, I want an energy drink. Did I think I was going to relapse from an energy drink at that time? No. But did I want to get a little jolt and a buzz? Yes. And do I think that would have been relapse right away? Of course not. But let me follow this up with one more thing. Within a 2-week period, I went to the good old Home Depot. Okay. Now, mind you, I've got 17 years sober, right? And I've got some sober time, and I'm at the Home Depot and firewood for winter, and I've got an axe, and they've got these handles that hold axes. And my first thought looking at those handles that I could hook the axe to was, oh, I could steal that. With well over 10 years sober working a program. And those two things together, okay, gave me the jolt of, whoa, I need to tone in on my physical, mental, emotional, because look how I'm trying to react. Why is my mind going to these things? This is distorted thinking. The way I think, the way I feel, the way I act can and will get me closer to a drink or drug. So I had to ramp up and be more conscious of myself, right? My treatment program, my foundational support, because those are 2 great examples of, oh, that's stinking thinking. Whoa, why do you want to cope that way? Why do you want to react by stealing like that? So that's powerful to be aware of. And by doing so and working with my network and my support, I mean, I was able to get farther away from a drink or drug and go, oh, those are good signs for me to look at.
Yeah, I think that's the advantage of, there's that saying in the recovery community of the opposite of addiction is connection, which didn't make sense in the beginning. I was like, what does it even mean? But as you were sharing your story, it really paints a really good picture of how awareness is important. But then the mind, I don't know if it's true from a meditator's point of view, the mind cannot be aware of his own. The mind cannot be aware of his own mind. It has to be a reference point outside of it. So I feel like that's where the recovery community and the connection with network and sponsor and other people comes in, And there's also one thing interesting is that, in the Buddhist world, there are only 3 roots of all the problems when it comes to the mind, negative emotions, all these things. depression, whatever it is, there are only three roots. One is greed, one is anger, and the other is delusion or ignorance.
I can relate.
So loba is greed, doda is anger or not wanting, hatred, and then delusion, moha, is not seeing things clearly.
Diminished recognition.
Yeah. So what's interesting with those three things is that for the anger, when somebody's angry, he might be aware that he's angry. That, oh, I'm angry and I don't want to be angry. There is an awareness. But then when somebody's greedy, like, oh yeah, I want this thing, I want to steal this thing, and you're aware of it. But the plot twist is that when you're delusional, you're lost. You cannot be aware of your own delusion, you know? So that's also where the addiction part, you know, because like you were saying earlier, this is a disease that tells you don't have it. So you are already in that deluded thinking, trying to figure out the delusion, which is lost. So that's why the recovery community and the outside source is helpful to bounce back idea, you know?
And I think the only difference between a addict, alcoholic, a substance user, I jokingly, people say earthlings or normies, people that don't abuse substances, is that non-addicts and non-alcoholics can stay in that delusion as long as they want. They can do other unhealthy coping skills all day in the form of lust, work, right? Gambling, whatever it is, they can stay in shop, whatever it is, they can stay in that unhealthy coping skill. But for an addict, those emotional ways of coping won't be enough. And the alcoholic or addict will eventually go back to substance use. That's the only difference. Other people can stay toxic and unhealthy and delusional and crave in other ways. But for a chemically addicted person or a dependent person, that won't be enough. And they'll eventually go back to chemicals.
That's great news to me, actually. Yeah. Because, that's why, you know, to reinforce your point earlier too about people who think they're fortunate, grateful. Mm-hmm. Because for me, as somebody in recovery as well, like I would rather wake up to the fact as opposed to being lost in this delusion. So the bottoms and all these difficulties prompted me to get out of it, you know. But unless I didn't seek recovery and stuck, that's a sad story. But
I tell people we do not have the luxury as people in recovery or addicts to stay in denial or stay in the delusion, because we're going to cope. We will find a way to cope, and eventually it'll be dysfunction. Eventually it'll be unhealthy behaviors, where we treat it holistically, physically, biologically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. And instead of it being dysfunctional manifestations, we get healthy and grateful.
Yeah. Speaking of good news, I feel like the very last sentence of that paragraph implies, not probably explicitly, but implicitly says something about good news. Do you want to read that part?
Without treatment or engagement in recovery activities, addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. So it gives you the solution right there. Treatment. Treat it. The only thing that I would change from this whole, from these wise physicians, is addiction is progressive and instead of can, will result in disability or premature death. So it mentions the need. It mentions the solution. Treatment. We have to treat this thing. We can't stay in denial. We have to look at the psychological, the biological, the social aspects, and spiritual. I always tell people that, what do the liquor stores say? Beer, wine, and spirits. Substances and alcohol take away your spirit. Having this spiritual part of self is, I think, a huge coping skill in this whole treatment process, and whatever spirituality means for you, the person in recovery. But I think it's a huge treatment-oriented part of this healing and recovery.
Yeah, this is just a thought to entertain, but as we're doing this podcast, I came up with this fantasy. It says at the top of the description, it says short description of addiction.
Yeah.
A short definition of addiction. We should come up with short definition of recovery. And then create our own organization.
I like that.
American Society of Recovery Medicine or Recovery Solution. Well, actually, yeah, that's what we're doing actually. So
yeah, we can complicate a whole lot, can't we? Part of this is, hey, let's find the solutions, and hopefully we helped you guys today have a more of a understanding of, wow, this is what the person with the addiction is going through. It makes more sense. Or I feel like I can relate and see this individual as a sick person, right? If someone is going through other medical illnesses that affect the brain, we have a little bit more compassion and understanding. We usually don't criminalize their illness.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think the last sentence is good news, which is a good contrast. It does say without treatment or engagement in recoveries, which can be translated as with treatment and engagement in recoveries, addiction can be arrested or can be stopped in a way. I like the word remission as well. That's also what I hear in recovery community. The disease of addiction is not cure. It's not gone. It's just in remission, which also means that it's just taking a break. It can come back anytime. Sure. So that's why they talk about this maintenance, spiritual maintenance, or whatever the maintenance is. You need to live in these recovery activities. Otherwise, you're either swimming or you're drowning. A tree is either dying or growing. There is no one point that you can. Yeah.
And I think it's important to know whether it's your first time in the recovery attempt or 33rd time, that no part of your recovery wants you to relapse. Only your addiction wants you to relapse. Now, you can certainly use relapses for your recovery. The examples that I gave with people that I work with individually in my relapse prevention group, and identifying those cyclical patterns that they can change and treat and do an action plan for a different way, that they can use that relapse for their recovery in the future. But man, your recovery doesn't want you to relapse. It's just this thing that's trying to take us down. Well,
yeah.
What do you think, Zol?
This is great. Yeah, this is very informational, very helpful. And I also like our conversation. I feel like that's the best part. I get to ask questions and I get to learn from you. So this is really fun. So
yeah, we're really enjoying this. We hope you guys are too. Please leave comments anywhere that you find this podcast, and give us any recommendations or thoughts or things that you liked about this episode. Any and all feedback is going to help us mold future episodes. And I know Zal highlighted some things that we'll have episodes on, like the Four Noble Truths and talking about cravings and a Buddhist perspective. And we certainly in future episodes will have wonderful guests as well that we get to highlight and do this with as well. So keep listening, like, comment, follow, and leave comments. That way we can see more things that you want for us to talk about from a solution and a collective approach. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.